as Chuck Schumer said, this time running in 2024 against Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. And today is February 24th, which marks the 1-year anniversary of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Now, before I get to that, I would like to actually share some photographs and talk a little bit about something which I, and actually my guest Gretchen Small and Jose Vega, who's handling the AV on this, we're all involved in over the weekend, over President's Day weekend, which is the Rage Against the War Machine demonstration in Washington, D.C., which I have to say was a phenomenal success. As best as I could tell, there were between 3,000 and 4,000 people there. It was coordinated by Nick Brana, the chairman, national chair of the People's Party, and Angela McArdle, who is the chairman of the National Committee of the Libertarian Party, parties with very different ideas about economic policy and other policies, but nonetheless share a concern that if we don't prevent a thermonuclear annihilation of the human race, thanks to the insanity of the West, that it won't matter what other things we agree or disagree on. So I'm just going to show some pictures of the Schiller Institute delegation. I was one of the speakers there, along with Tulsi Gabbard, Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, Cynthia McKinney by video, Jimmy Dore, Kim Iverson, and many others that you probably are familiar with. Max Blumenthal started the rally, and there were many people who are correspondents who have documented the atrocities being committed by the Nazi-infested Ukrainian military against the people of the Donbass, which was, of course, a deliberate provocation of Russia. So I'll just show a few pictures of this. So here are the Schiller Institute banners participating in the parade. And these banners were quite visible behind the speakers during the rally part, which is in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and then several hundred or a couple thousand, I'm not sure, 1,000 of the participants marched over to the White House, where there were more speeches. Jose Vega spoke there and others. There I am speaking, and you see how it looks. The majority of the crowd was in front of me, but there were also another, I don't know, 1,000, 500,000 people behind us. And you see that very nice Schiller Institute banner and the crowd gathered behind. Here is what the crowd looked like in part from the front. You're just seeing one half of them here, partly the other half, and you see the various signs. There was a sign over to one side that said Biden is the Nord Stream bomber or something like that. Very good. There I am over by the White House getting interviewed by a reporter from, I'm not sure where, I can't remember. And here is the delegation, and you see Daniel Burke, Nick Brana, myself, another activist. I'm not sure which group he's with, Veterans for Peace, Code Pink, Jose Vega there, and then members of the Schiller Institute and Code Pink delegations. This is only about a third, maybe, of the people who participated Tuesday in lobbying, going to many, many congressional offices, telling them to stop funding the war in Ukraine and to negotiate peace, and also getting out the Cy Hirsch article on the Biden's orders and collusion with Norway in the Nord Stream pipeline. bombings and sabotage. So I thought that this was very effective, actually, and maybe partly because Congress was not in session, we were able to have lengthy meetings with many staffers. Also, I'd just like to stress the dynamic of the rally was really incredible. It was organized on the principle that Helga LaRouche has been discussing, which is the coincidence of opposites, so that everybody there was prepared to be meeting people with whom they disagreed. And they had pre-decided that none of these disagreements would make any difference whatsoever in our cooperation. And I have to say, it just created the most incredible dynamic of goodwill. People were calm, people were happy to see each other. There were people there who have thrown me out of meetings or taken the microphone away from me when I've tried to speak. Everyone had put all of this aside because we realized that we have to be unified. And of course, the game of the enemy, as is always the game of the British Empire, is divide and rule. Divide and conquer, and make everyone as hysterical as possible about their disagreements. So none of this was there either among the speakers or the participants. Now, a couple of things of note. First of all, the House Oversight Committee, which is now chaired by Representative James Comer from Kentucky, has demanded records. They've been given 14 days from Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, and Samantha Power of the USAID. The committee wants the records of where the $113 billion that has been sent to Ukraine has gone. It'll be interesting to see whether they can come up with that. Seymour Hersh's article, we had Ray McGovern, whom many of my listeners will know, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs, both brought in to testify at the UN Security Council on the question of the role of the United States and other NATO countries in committing an act of war against Germany and Russia, namely blowing up the pipeline. This was covered in the Washington Post, and the Washington Post even included a link to Seymour Hersh's article, so you have a sense that things are breaking out. Jose Vega yesterday, was it yesterday? Yes, intervened, or the day before. Jose, you can say something. Intervened on Hakeem Jeffries. What day was that? Everything's blurring together. All right, Jose is muted, but at any rate, it was in the last day and a half, and was very, very clear on the question of the Nord Stream pipeline and why is Congress not investigating whether this is true, whether the Constitution was violated by their not being informed that Biden was giving orders to commit an act of war. And that has gone all over the place. Millions of views. They showed it on Jesse Waters' show on Fox TV last night, and there's more to come. And let me just say, everyone watching this should be on the lookout in your area for your congressman or any, ill-intended person, if they are holding a town hall meeting, to go and intervene and insist they stop lying to us. Here in New York, I'm embarrassed to say that our own Governor Hochul, on the anniversary of this war, gave a stark, raving, mad speech. I think she's as senile as the president, saying that all support to Ukraine, this was an assault by Russia, and Ukraine is going to be victorious. Now, maybe she lives near the Banderas training camps in New York, so she feels vulnerable. I'm not sure, but I'm frankly embarrassed. What does the governor of a state have to do with military actions and military policy of the United States? So highly inappropriate. And I'm also embarrassed. The last I was in Albany, the Ukrainian flag is hanging on top of our Capitol, just under the US flag. Now, Otherwise, President Putin gave a State of the Union address. And I just want to share a little bit about what he had to say to give you a sense of the quality of leadership that he has been exhibiting. And also, I wanted to say something about China, which has now offered a 12-point roadmap, in a sense, for a ceasefire. So in the vacuum of leadership of the West, China has stepped forward to put forward a proposal for how a ceasefire might be achieved and the kind of steps that must be taken, including respect for sovereignty of all nations equally, including Russia's. But here, a little bit of what Putin said. 1 year ago, to protect the people in our historical lands, to ensure the security of our country, and to eliminate the threat coming from the neo-Nazi regime that had taken hold in Ukraine after the 2014 coup, it was decided to begin the special military operation. Step by step, carefully and consistently, we will deal with the tasks we have at hand. Skipping some. The appalling method of deception, and this is referring particularly to Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, both admitting that they were lying. They never intended the Minsk Accords to work. They were just buying time to prepare to attack Russia. Now, think about that. The Minsk Accord process began several years ago, long before the special military operation. So the West was planning an act of aggression against Russia. So Putin says, this appalling method of deception has been tried and tested many times before. They behaved just as shamelessly and duplicitously when destroying Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. They will never be able to wash off this shame. The concepts of honor, trust, and decency are not for them. They got used to splitting the whole world. It turned out that they treat people living in their own countries with the same disdain like a master. Think about what's happening in East Palestine, Ohio, with that horrible toxic chemical train wreck situation and what the residents are going through there, and the fact that Biden prioritized sending visiting Kiev and sending more weapons to Zelensky over addressing a crisis in the United States. Putin also makes the point that the West has spent $150 billion on helping. This is not just the U.S. The U.S. is at about, I guess, $113 billion, so another $37 billion, helping and arming the Kiev regime. But the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the G7 only spent $60 billion to help the world's poorest countries. All right, so we have $150 billion for Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin to wage war on Ukraine and kill countless thousands of people. But when it comes to saving millions of people, the threat of mass starvation that so many people are facing in the world today, floods, earthquakes like Syria and Turkey, where we can't even lift the sanctions, only $60 billion. So for people who think that the moral bankruptcy of the West is not visible to the world, Putin calls it out. And then he says, according to U.S. experts, almost 900,000 people were killed during wars unleashed by the United States after 2001, and over 38 million became refugees. He says also, of interest, we are not at war with the people of Ukraine. I have made that clear many times. The people of Ukraine have become hostages of the Kiev regime and its Western handlers. The West is using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia and a testing range. And then he goes on to also speak about culture and identity of Russia. Saying millions of people in the West realize that they are being led to a spiritual disaster. Frankly, the elite appear to have gone crazy, and it looks like there is no cure for that. But like I said, these are their problems, while we must protect our children, which we will do. Now, the other big news, as people have heard, is that Russia has suspended participation in the START treaties. That is, they haven't withdrawn, but he makes this specific point. First of all, because of the sanctions, the Russians can't get visas. They're not able to inspect anything. So the U.S. is not upholding its end of the deal. Russia cannot do the inspections that are in this treaty. So they say, why are we going to talk about the treaty? He also says, if the U.S. and NATO are openly saying that their goal is to inflict strategic defeat on Russia, Putin says, after such statements, are they supposed to tour our defense facilities, including the latest ones, as if nothing has happened? I signed an executive order putting new land-based strategic systems on combat duty. Are they going to poke their nose in there as well? Do they think we will let them go there just because? So he basically implies that this whole thing is insane. He says, they are using NATO to give us signals, which in fact is an ultimatum whereby Russia should, no questions asked, implement everything that it agreed to, including the New START treaty, whereas they will do as they please. As if there is no connection between strategic offensive weapons and the conflict in Ukraine or other hostile Western actions against our country. As if there are no vociferous claims about them seeking to inflict a strategic defeat on us. This is either the height of hypocrisy and cynicism or the height of stupidity, but they are not idiots. They are not stupid after all. They want to inflict a strategic defeat on us and also get to our nuclear sites. And then at the end, he just says, Russia will meet any challenges because we are all one country, a big and united nation. We are confident in ourselves and confident in our strength. Oh, and this reminds me, I forgot to show something else that I wanted to show you, which is very exciting about this Rage Against the War mobilization, because, so here's the Congress. This is all over the world to have a sense of unity. The revolt in the captive nations of King Charles, the captive nations of the British Empire. Here is Munich, where they were expecting just a couple thousand people, and reports are anywhere from 13,000 to 40,000 people showed up during the Munich Security Conference. This was on the 18th of February, the day before the rally in DC. And there are going to be more demonstrations there and in several, about 100 cities in Germany tomorrow and throughout the week. Here is a rally that occurred in Denmark today. I understand there were about 150 people there. Stop NATO's war in Ukraine. Yes to the Pope's peace initiative. And then here, this one's in English. Stop NATO military dictatorship and terror against Russia. Stop NATO. A lot of people are not that happy about NATO. And then here we have yesterday, this is in Austin, Texas, where we had a good crowd gathered, and you see the signs, don't let Biden stumble into World War III, peace for Russia and Ukraine, rage against the war machine, honor JFK and MLK, release the files. So again, another rally, and tomorrow there will be a substantial rally in the UK, and Helga LaRouche was on a Twitter space today with Nick Brana of the People's Party, Angela McArdle of the Libertarian Party, and Chris Williamson, a former member of the Parliament of UK, who was one of the speakers at the UK rally. So again, people putting aside their differences, coming together to break the back of this thing. Now, before I introduce Gretchen Small, what I want to do is just show a clip of Mr. LaRouche, which I think explains, because what we've been talking about, what we began last week was the 40, 50-year battle of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche to establish a new paradigm, to create a new order of economic and political relations on the planet. And this was considered a huge threat, so much so that LaRouche was thrown in jail, had 400 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals raiding his house, had all of his publications shut down, declared involuntarily bankrupt, and was called every name in the book. And I want to just show you a clip of him because I think it's important that people get to know him. I'm sorry, the audio is not really great, but hopefully you'll be able to hear it, and maybe Jose can help by turning something up. It's as loud as, let's see here. I'll make it a bit louder on my end too. So here we go. We're just going to hear the first few minutes of this.
Is one of three elements of policy about which the future existence of civilization depends, including the continuation of civilization even as far distant as the end of this century. It is a policy which, in part, the land bridge element, has been adopted by China, which is now receiving cooperation from Iran, significant cooperation from Iran, for reasons which Helga will indicate, has recently received endorsement and offers of cooperation from the President of India in meetings, public meetings with Jiang Zemin of China. It has the expressed interest of Turkey by the present Prime Minister Erdogan in terms of cooperation with Iran. Recently, we've had the government of Armenia has emphasized its importance of its collaboration with Iran because of this kind of policy. It has the support in significant degree of the Foreign Ministry of Russia, Evgeny Primakov, and in the most recent period, since the French government has broken with the British government in a dramatic move over the issue of British Commonwealth genocide in Africa, that the French government has entered into new degrees of cooperation with Germany, both against British Commonwealth genocide in Africa and also in support of Germany's, France's, Russia's, and other countries' interest in cooperation with Iran, with India, with Asia and Russia in developing this type of orientation of economic cooperation across Eurasia, across continental Eurasia, and into Africa. Now, the background of this is how we got into this business. It started formally in 1982-83, when I was invited by representatives of the U.S. executive branch to set up a back-channel discussion with the Soviet government. And it was agreed that the subject of my discussion would include, among other things, a presentation of my design for a strategic ballistic missile defense to be mutually supported, hopefully, by both governments. The development of which would be utilized to provide new technologies for recovery of the world in general from the economic disaster which was already then in progress. During 1982, from February of 82 to February of 1983, I conducted negotiations through this back channel with the Soviet government. In February, the Soviet government turned down the policy recommendation I made, though they were still interested in economic discussions. But in March of the same year, 23rd, the President of the United States, Reagan, adopted and presented the policy which I'd been discussing with the Soviets and became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now,
okay, so I'm going to stop there, but I think that gives some idea. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Gretchen Small, a longtime LaRouche associate writer involved in intelligence work for LaRouche's publication, Executive Intelligence Review. And I'm so glad you could join us again, Gretchen. Thanks for being here.
No, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy your symposium, Diane, because it's a good conversation with people. What I wanted to discuss today, sort of carrying on from what we did last week, was the way that LaRouche understands or understood, I guess we have to say, the relationship between all the different economic programs that we showed last week, and Diane may show again later for Syria, because we have a whole magnificent Operation Phoenix uh, plan that we've developed for that poor afflicted country. But what LaRouche went at is something which I think people don't really understand, which is the relationship between economics and thermonuclear war, the relationship between these economic programs we're talking about and how we can avoid thermonuclear war. And because LaRouche went at it as a one, that those two aspects, he viewed humanity as a whole, he viewed human history as a whole, he viewed his own role as a continuation of someone who was taking personal responsibility for making a contribution to humanity that would make the human species better than when he left it. That was his concept, which every human being should have. So I think this is also the core of why the financial oligarchy hated and feared Lyndon LaRouche, and why, I might add, why they hate and fear Diane's candidacy, which is carrying on that work that he's been doing. So economics and war are not separate categories. In fact, in 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, left our currency floating, since then it's not been a US currency. It's under the control of the usurers in the city of London and Wall Street. And he warned at that time, when Nixon did that unless we changed that course, that policy, we were going to be heading towards a Great Depression, fascism, breakdown, and likely war. So LaRouche being LaRouche, he began organizing people in the US and around the world around an alternative. And some of this we discussed last week, but just to situate it again, he proposed in particular in April 1975 the creation of an international development bank. And you can show slide 1 here, Jose, if you have it there. This was his proposal for a whole new system around which all of the world could cooperate for mutual development for the benefit of everyone. We called it the IDB. I don't know how to screen share, but that's all right, you'll see it. And this was designed as the core of the IDB was to be the core of a new global monetary system in which usury is banned, has nothing to do with the system, whatever, and financial credit, there we go, which is being issued, serves the purpose of developing, creating, and financing physical economic development of all the nations and peoples of the planet. Now, even by 1975, Henry Kissinger, the city of London, Wall Street recognized that LaRouche was becoming a major strategic threat. Kissinger, forced a major symposium that had been organized in Paris with leading figures to participate, including from the developing sector. And Mr. LaRouche was going to discuss the idea of the IDB. And Kissinger got it shut down. We don't know I don't know anyway, what specific threats were issued, but I can tell you once, many years later, I met with a Central American diplomat in Washington, D.C., who, when I called and said, this is LaRouche, and et cetera, he said, set up a meeting with an aide, as the ambassador. He set up a meeting with the aide. When I walked in, the meeting was really with the ambassador. The ambassador had the door closed. And then he said, I was in Paris in 1975. And how do you people dare say what you say? He was supportive. but he was terrified. So who knows what Kissinger did to close it down. But it's like he showed me he had books on the side of his desk of every fax. At that time we had faxes of newsletters that the EIR had been sending out because people knew these were the ideas they needed. So then in 1976, after the IDB had been studied in countries across the world, several leaders of developing nation sectors began calling publicly for LaRouche's idea. Fred Wills before the United Nations General Assembly, for the foreign minister of Guyana, and various other, Indira Gandhi, the Peruvian foreign minister, General de la Flor. So Kissinger began counterattacking, driving people out of office. I can mention just one case here, which I know firsthand because I was involved in this. In early October of 1976, the police, national police in Peru, raided the office of our news service at that time, which was called New Solidarity International Press Service, NSIPS. They arrested everyone there, which included me, and shut the office down, took all the literature, ran NSIPS out of the country, and including sending several Peruvians, they were Peruvian nationals who were part of the LaRouche movement, forced them into exile. So that was an exciting thing to learn when you're in your 20s about how the world works. When we came back many years later, we found out from Freedom of Information Acts that arrest order had been associated directly with Henry Kissinger, who had sent out a cable to embassies around the world deal with this problem. And I have to say also with the help of Associated Press. So the media was no better in 1976 than it is today. I arrived back in the United States for the concluding weeks of LaRouche's first campaign for the president as a U.S. Labor Party candidate. That was a party that he created on the basis of physical economic policies. And I was in time for his packed public conference in Manhattan, where he warned that the financial and political interests behind Jimmy Carter had an economic program that meant nuclear war, and it had to be stopped. So on a few days later, on October 27th, Lyndon LaRouche took that warning and that concept to the American public. We didn't have any honeypots, like we don't have honeypots now. We fundraised the money to buy a 1/2 hour program to be broadcast on NBC. And I don't remember whether it was at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, but it was in prime time. And we paid for it, as I recall, in the last minute with cash in brown paper bags. So when Diane asks you to support her campaign, understand that's the kind of thing that your money can do, because that's the way LaRouche financed his campaign all the way through. Now, that's where he delivered this dramatic warning that Jimmy Carter could mean rapidly that we would have an outbreak of thermonuclear war. Now, I want to give some quotes from this national broadcast, because LaRouche explained there how Malthusian genocide and nuclear war are the two sides of the same coin. And of course, as usual, he showed what the alternative was. Now, Jose, the second slide there, right? So I'll just read it. This is what he talked about of the plan, and he gave a lot more details. He talked about named the names George Ball, William Paddock, some other top financiers and people who had a plan to shut the border on Mexico, make them scream to reduce their population. It was a big call for the fact that the world could not sustain the number of people on it because the bankers had a monetary crisis. Their bankrupt system, which was bankrupted because of what Nixon did on 1971 and the policies toward that, had got them in a bit of trouble. And here's what LaRouche told people. This is what is being imposed on the world and the United States people. Quote, the methods to which they, meaning the bankers, are resorting are consciously modeled upon those used earlier by Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi finance minister. That is, they are resorting to methods of extreme austerity, auto-cannibalistic austerity. in the effort to squeeze out of real income, out of essential social services, and out of the capital of industry itself, sufficient wealth to roll over for at least a little time some of the bankrupt debt holdings of certain financial interests. These measures, he went on to say, are bad enough in the advanced sector. They are bad enough in the United States. We see in New York City what this leads to. But in the developing sector, these measures mean genocide. Now, look in the next slide to consider how timely his warning was for what we face today. What they propose to do, he said, is to put the developing sector under effectively NATO military and political control. Such a policy, putting most of the developing sector under this kind of NATO sovereignty, means war with the Soviet Union. This is where the immediate danger arises. And he went on to warn that there are some people in the establishment, like there are today, I might add, who are thinking in terms of how to fight a thermonuclear war. That is, recognizing that the policy of imposed genocide upon the developing sector means world war, rather than give up their policy. They propose to discover how to fight nuclear war. So then LaRouche went on to contrast that insanity to his alternative. Now, this was the IDB, and he presented what he presented to the developing sector, to the American people. He and organizers with him had been circulating and discussing this with industrialists and local bankers and trade unionists and political leaders and activists in both Democratic and Republican parties. Many of the people who agreed with the general perspective had big disagreements between them. But as LaRouche reported on his broadcast, many people agreed on 3 points in particular. One, that we cannot allow this to get to war. Two, that the monetary crisis had to be resolved. Some measures had to be taken. And three, and this is very important, that the American tradition of technological progress, industrial expansion, agricultural development, and the full employment that results from those policies are what this grouping, the Labor Party and the people around us in the Democratic and Republican parties who agreed with this. This is what people agreed on. So then, and now the next slide, Jose, please. He explained the IDB idea to his fellow citizens this way, in what it meant for them. He said, in this nation, meaning the United States, we would turn around from industrial decay and enter a period of high capital formation with full utilization of our idle capacity, industrial capacity, with the expansion of that capacity, with the modernization of that capacity, and with jobs representing increasing skill levels available to a greater number of our population. With the tax revenues available to the federal government coming from that expansion, we would then be able to meet the needs of our population. Next slide. And he goes on to say, without a new monetary system, without major sources of new credit to revitalize industrial production, without credit to establish the markets in the developing sector necessary to revitalize that production in the United States, the United States is going into the worst depression of history. But if we create those credits, then we're going to have the greatest prosperity in all history. And then he added, furthermore, if we establish such a monetary system, then the basic cause of the danger of war is eliminated. That's the key. Now, you can imagine what it would be like to have turned on NBC at 8 or 9 o'clock at night and heard a candidate the media had never told you was a candidate, speaking to you not like you were a child, but a citizen with a right and an obligation to have a say in national policies at a time when their lives were at stake. And probably they hadn't really realized that at that time either. Okay, so that was in 1976. Fast forward to 1983, 1984. And that's where the nuclear war danger was still, or maybe even more, very, very live. And for 5 years or more, LaRouche had championed the idea that you heard, hopefully part of what he said in the clip that Diane showed, of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And that was the idea that the US and the Soviet Union cooperate on developing beam weapons, that is, laser technology weapons, which could shoot down ballistic missiles in the atmosphere so that before they could destroy civilization, and use the spin-off technologies from that program to transform the civilian economies of both nations and all nations involved. And through the platform he was talking about was using laser technologies in a whole realm to change our industrial base. President Ronald Reagan proposed that program to the nation on March 23rd, 1983 on national television. A year later, in March of 1984, LaRouche drafted what he called a draft memorandum of agreement between the United States of America and the USSR. Now, in the next slide, he explained. So he was trying to build peace. And here's how he was proposing that the US and the Soviet Union, which was then very much an enemy of the United States, what were the terms that we could have peace that would last? So in the next slide, he gave that's the one before, actually. That I hope. Yep, there you go. In his notes to it, what he said at the beginning, strategy is not a military question, but a political and an economic question. The strategic military policy of the United States towards the Soviet Union must be an instrument for establishing those political and economic policy relations between the powers which serve as the basis for durable peace. And now you see how he begins. This is the next slide, Jose. It's the first article on this is what he called the kernel of his program. Article 1, General Conditions for Peace. And this I included pretty much the whole thing, and I think I'll read it quickly, but this is really interesting. This is for, he said there are two superpowers at war, and here's what he says. The political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress to the mutual benefit of each and all. And then he went on, then the next one slide, the most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations, often classed as developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Remember, I told you this would be very apropos of where we are today. In the next slide, he went on to say, this I'll read quickly, I think. Insofar as the United States and the Soviet Union acknowledge the process of productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interests of each and both. And let me just say the process of productive powers of labor, he's talking about raising the productive power of physical economic power of nations and the individuals, human beings who produce it. So he said, if insofar as the two powers are bound to that degree in that way by a common interest to this increasing of the productive powers of labor, this is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice indispensable to fostering of durable peace between those two powers. That's what the kernel is, he said. In other words, it is the Soviet Union and the United States should cooperate on developing the former colonial sector. And together, all nations, Europe, the United States, everyone can come together. Only after he's discussed, that's the first article. Then he goes on to discuss technological policy. Then he talks about economic policy. Then he talks about international monetary policy. And only then does he get to military policy. The Article 5. And then there are 3 articles, including Article 5 that follows. Here's the conclusion of the first of those military articles. And Jose, this is another slide now. called Article 5 on military doctrines. It's the one before that, right? On the part of the United States of America, the government is committed to avoiding all colonial, imperial, or of kindred endeavors in foreign policy, and to establish instead a growing community of principle among fully sovereign nation states of this planet. With respect to the Soviet Union, the government of the United States offers the Soviet Union cooperation with itself, meaning the United States government, in service of these principles, and desires that the Soviet Union might enter into full participation within that community of principle. When I reread this for the umpteenth time to prepare for this, it reminded me very much of how daring John F. Kennedy was when he went, and I believe it was in 1962, before the United Nations, and said, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and proposed that there be collaboration between the United States and the Soviet Union on going to the moon together. It's the same shape of thinking. Now, very quickly, what you need to know on this, and now I'm summing up real quickly here. The warmongers in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party went wild. There were slanders everywhere about LaRouche, but the same thing happened in the Soviet Union, because the Andropov, the leader at the time, was British oriented and British allied. And so the Soviet press was filled with slanders against LaRouche and his Teutonic wife, meaning German, and which meant you had to be bad. So it was so thick, like it was here, that Russian scientists and key members of the intelligentsia got really interested. Who is this man? Why is he under this attack? And they looked up his what they could get of his material and studied it. And so after Bush Sr. had done the dirty work to get LaRouche sentenced to a 15-year jail sentence, and he was released after serving a third of it under Clinton, but he spent 5 years in jail. He was on parole for another 10 years, but actually, I think it might have been 5, but that's aside. But within 3 months of him being released from jail, he was in Moscow discussing with leaders in Russia the ideas that he had developed. You could show the slide of him in the Duma. This was the Duma meeting was in the one before. No, well, all right. That the meeting with Glassiev, that's okay. Don't worry about it. He was, by then, what he was proposing, the LaRouche's had developed the concept of the Eurasian land bridge, which that slide would be good now, Jose, where when the Berlin Wall fell, for pulling together all these different regional projects that we've been working on this time into one concept for unifying humanity in the common aim of eliminating poverty everywhere, and thereby creating many, many geniuses everywhere, which would allow this flourishing of humanity, and we would be then in a great position to go out and explore the heavens. So that idea then became, the next slide, Jose, you could see the covers of the World Land Bridge Report. It's published, it's the new Silk Road becomes this World Land Bridge. In other words, we took what was the Eurasian land bridge, connected it through the Bering Strait into the United States, down through the Panama, Darien Gap into South America. The whole world together as one. Here you can see the cover there on the right of published in Chinese. And then the last slide I want to show is Diane speaking at the rally. Because when you see Diane, and you see the map, right? The map behind it on peace through development, you see Diane, you have to remember that she's not just a tough fighter, which she is, but she's coming with a solution that she has worked on, that Mr. LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche have worked on and thought out and developed people who support it all over the world and in the United States. So this is a power that when you join with Diane's campaign, you're really accessing world history. That's what I had to offer.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think you've been so efficient that I will say a little bit about the operation or project Phoenix, because I think it's just another example, and it's a way of helping people to think about something hideously tragic. And I don't know how many of our viewers participated in the online symposium organized by Helga and the Schiller Institute earlier this week, where we had a number of speakers, including Vanessa Bealey, Janice Kortkamp, Senator Richard Black, talking about the horror, I mean, just absolutely horrific situation in Syria. But this can be solved, especially in the context of the Belt and Road. So I'm actually going to just quickly review this, and people can look up on the Schiller Institute website, Project Phoenix, and get much more documentation, but it's just a way to think about it. So we'll go to that right now. Hold on. Okay, so this is just a picture of the city of Aleppo, which apparently is one of the oldest cities in the world. It existed 10,000 years ago, and has been through every kind of strife imaginable, and that's why we called the Project Phoenix, rising from the ashes of war. Now, this city prior to the war had 2.1 million people living in it, and then about 10 kilometers northeast of Aleppo, and it just shows you how Syria was thinking. They had actually built a new industrial city in the year 2000. I don't know when the US last built a city, which included 413 industrial firms with an additional 1,129 industrial firms underway. So Syria was a growing, forward-looking nation prior to the assassination of Gaddafi, and what LaRouche warned was the beginning of a nuclear war with the intent of targeting Russia. So what Project Phoenix sets out to do are these things: financing the reconstruction of Syria. And by the way, this project was put out in 2016 by associates of LaRouche, just a couple days after Aleppo was liberated from ISIS, with the assistance, I have to say, of Russia, which got involved in that situation in the fall of 2015, because it simply was untenable to allow the overthrow of the last stable government in Southwest Asia that was not a religious government. Here we go. And someone's asking, the land bridge, is this what China and Russia are talking about? Yes, it is what you just saw. So, and then connecting Syria to the new Silk Road, which means upgrading the transport system with high-speed rail, transcontinental routes between the Mediterranean. And this is the amazing thing, and Assad had actually called for this earlier, I think in 2009, before the war. He called it the 5 Cs: Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Red Sea, Caspian Sea, Black Sea, and you'll see that in a minute when I get to the map. And then the corridors on the new Silk Road: east-west and east-west, north-south corridors, rail, pipelines, water, industry, agriculture, cities, nuclear desalination and atmospheric ionization, land reclamation and irrigation to green the deserts. So here is a map showing Syria in the World Land Bridge, and you see some of these corridors here that are being talked about. Number one is the west to east land route to Baghdad. So here's Syria. That's Aleppo, by the way, that ancient city up there. And this is the corridor to Baghdad. This exists except for this little snip of rail, only 150 kilometers worth of rail. I guess that's about 90 miles has to be built to complete this whole thing. And then you see the maritime Silk Road connecting at the port of Latakia here and I think Basra there. The north-south link to Egypt and Africa. So this link going down this way, and you have over here, the Suez Canal, which the Egyptian government doubled the width so it could take two-way traffic. The northern link from Europe, the Black Sea region up here, okay, over here through Turkey, and into Russia, going up this way through Iran into Russia, and then the Mediterranean maritime link, which of course you get into the Mediterranean and then it's all of Europe that is open to you. So you can see the enormous potential, the central location. It makes sense going back to the ancient Silk Road, why Syria would have been a cradle of civilization with these beautiful ancient cities like Palmyra, Aleppo, Damascus, etc. Maybe that's it for my map since nothing more seems to be coming up. I think that is the end of the maps. So, I mean, that's just doesn't give it justice. But if you think of the horror, if you think of the way people are living after the earthquake and the sanctions and the mass exodus of millions of refugees, many of whom are very well educated and highly skilled, who could be coming back to build the country, you can consider both the horror and the great potential. And the way this would be paid for is twofold. One, you need a national bank or some kind of national entity against which you can issue or which can issue credit for infrastructure. But to get a lot of foreign investments, you need large foreign credit, which China has been very willing to offer. And I will say in the neighboring country of Iraq, there has been a deal of petroleum for infrastructure between Iraq and China. So again, I think you see why the West, why the NATO powers, why the British Empire would be throwing such rage fits to absolutely prevent this, but also the incredible potential. And this is what we have to do, is not merely to stop war, but to actually build the peace. So, and Gretchen, you're getting an invitation, by the way, online to address our collaborator Bernie Holland's meeting in the UK over Zoom. So we'll talk about that after, but that's really what I wanted to present. So Jose, if you can put us, we're both up here. That's, what do you think, Gretchen? What should we add to this?
The one thing I would add is that if people have not seen that symposium from Tuesday, I really recommend you watch it. After Helga begins it, and then Vanessa Beeley speaks, and then retired Colonel Richard Black, and former senator. And at the end of that, I was almost in tears, and I know this, but and then Colonel Black finished by saying something which I think is really what we have to concentrate on now, which is, he said, if the American people knew what is being done by their government to the nation of Syria, this government would fall. And he wasn't just the way he did it, and because he'd gone through the context. This is a policy against Syria that has gone on from Obama to Trump to under Biden. So that system would fall. And I think he's right. And then Helga later on, in part of it said, basically, she said, look, Syria, what's being done against Syria is the face of the system. And that's the system that's leading us to thermonuclear war. And if we and people know that, I think the American people want to cooperate with most of the world. We do not want to be another British Empire, hated around the world, which right now it's very serious. And I've organized in these areas for a long time, and you always had some anti-Americanism, but you always had this sort of people remembering Kennedy, people remembering Washington, people remembering Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy, and those kind of things. And there was some reservoir. And now it's really, you have to remind people of who the United States actually is. And I think that what Colonel Black said is true. If people know what our government has been doing in their name, and then people know what Diane was going through, what LaRouche tried to present the whole time, it's all unnecessary. It's all unnecessary. We can be working together. It's seizing on the Chinese opportunity offered in the Belt and Road, as Diane told the Rage Against the War rally. That's what the United States should do. And then we're home free with a little work.
Yeah, I would say so. And I would say, I think what you're saying is very important also for Americans, because one of the reasons why they've worked so hard to destroy history, why they're pushing this cancel culture, is what they're teaching young people is that the US was the British Empire. We were based on slavery. America got rich on slavery. No, we didn't. We didn't get rich on slavery. Slavery is very limited because you're limited by the human body. How much weight can you carry? It was the industrial progress, which Hamilton understood so clearly, and then Lincoln picked up on, the American system of political economy, which was not British free trade. And in fact, our entire Constitution, Declaration of Independence, our very being was in defiance of British imperial policy. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get rid of slavery until after the so-called, what I would call the War of the Rebellion. But our nation was not prosperous because of it. It was actually a detriment to our nation.
Absolutely.
And I think people just don't know this. You don't get to read original source documents in school. You have all these, the Houghton Mifflin Company, I think, is based in the UK. So we have all these, our history books are published by the people against whom we had the revolution. And I don't mean that against the poor British subjects who I think are desperately working to make a revolution of their own and are going to have a huge demonstration tomorrow in the UK. And everyone listening, you should come out. I'm not sure I know where it is. I mean, in the US, at least you could get a permit and have a rally. They had to keep changing the location because every time they got a venue, it would get canceled as soon as they would announce it. So any final words for this evening? And I don't mean final. I hope they're not, because I think we intend to win this fight. I think we can see the grip of King Charles and his lackeys here in the US and the EU and NATO is beginning to shatter. But we have a lot of work to do, and it is very urgent in such a battle that you have your eye on where mankind should be, what the world should look like. It's not enough to just be against. Yes, beautiful. That's very clear.
Earth's next 50 years. Let's get on to it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I hope, with any luck, to see you next week and to be able to report on millions of people having been in the streets all over the world.
Good.
Good night.